The book is called Blood Royal, Dynastic Politics in Medieval Europe. And the seed of it came from a definite invitation I received some years back to give a lecture series at Trinity College Dublin. And when I receive an invitation from Trinity College Dublin, I always say yes. They had somehow or other got money to fund a new lecture series on medieval history. And it's named in honor of James Lydon, who was professor of medieval history at Trinity for many years. And they gave me freedom to choose my topic. So I went and gave 4 lectures over 4 days on the subject of dynasties. And of course, the book has grown very much from then. The book is about 600 pages. And since I'm going to be talking now for 25 minutes before we go over to question mode, I'm not going to try and gabble through everything in it, like one of those opera plots in 60 seconds that you sometimes hear. I'm going to try and outline the main approach of the book with a couple of examples. So to start with, I start with a very obvious point, but I'm trying to look at this systematically. Most countries in medieval Europe were monarchies. In fact, most countries in medieval Europe were monarchies down to World War I. And that meant that there was a family that was in power. And in almost every case, that family was a hereditary ruling family. That's what a dynasty is, a hereditary ruling family. And it was part of the purpose of these families to ensure the continuation of their power, the transmission and succession of dynastic power. And I include a little quote I'll give you from Margaret of Burgundy, who was the sister of Edward IV and Richard III of England. And she's talking about England, but this applies, I think, to all the kingdoms of medieval Europe. In this kingdom, a king is constituted not by the wishes of the people, or by election, or by the right of war, but by the propagation of blood. And I took that as my text, the propagation of blood. How do these ruling families ensure that? And because it's a very strongly patriarchal society, it was particularly propagation of blood, meaning father-son transmission of power. The kings and emperors wanted sons. There were female sovereigns in medieval Europe. I have a chapter in the book on female sovereigns. I made a list of 27. I may have missed some, and we can perhaps talk about that in the question time if you're interested. But it was this father-son transmission goal that these dynasties sought, and some managed to achieve remarkably well. The so-called Capetian kings of France, who came to the throne in 987, for example, transmitted the throne from father to son for well over 300 years, which is quite remarkable, actually. So how do they do that? I identified, I would call them 2 models of how you might try and go about this transmission, father-son transmission. The first is one you find in the early Middle Ages, in the Merovingian dynasty, the kings of the Franks, in Ireland, native Ireland, in Scandinavia, at least down to the 12th century. And in this system, the king, the ruler, would have many sexual partners. It might be serial monogamy. Sometimes there might be women called wives and women called concubines. There could be unions with slave women. But the point of it all was that all the children, all the sons who were born from these various liaisons of various kinds would have royal blood and would have a claim to some kind of authority and power, even the ones born of slaves. And the advantage of that system, if we can call it a system, is that the chances of a king having sons were very high. Yeah, it's very unlikely that a king would not leave any sons. And that means that the dynasties have enormous continuity. They're not going to die out. So, for example, the Irish ruling dynasties of the 10th century, the O'Connors and MacMurroughs and so on, are pretty much the Irish ruling dynasties of the 16th century. So there's that continuity of the dynasty. The disadvantage of the system, obviously, is that there might be dozens of sons, and later on, of course, dozens of cousins and so on, all thinking that they had a claim. And the result of that was very intense conflict within the dynasty, much of it very bloody. Both the history of the Merovingian kings, the history of the native Irish kings, and the history of the early Scandinavian kings is marked by an enormous amount of killing of brothers and cousins. The other model, Model 2, which was dominant in most parts of Europe from at least the year 1000 and in some places earlier, was the one that fitted much more with the model of marriage that the Western Church eventually developed. That is, men and women should be monogamous. Marriage was a monogamous institution. A king could only have one wife at a time. And to end a marriage was very difficult. There was in the Middle Ages, in the canon law of the church, technically no divorce in the sense of this was a legitimate marriage and now we're going to end it. But there was annulment, which meant there's something wrong with this marriage from the very beginning and it wasn't a real marriage. So that was really the only way a marriage could be ended legally. And the church imposed fairly strict conditions for an annulment. And a consequence of all this was that the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate offspring became much sharper. It was now clear that the legitimate offspring were the offspring of a marriage made by church rules. And it's that world that I then go on to discuss in part 1 of the book. Now, the book is in 2 parts, and part 1 is called the life cycle. And in that, as its name suggests, I go through the different phases structurally and thematically. I take my examples from many times and places. I'm discussing the whole of Christian Europe, really, and in the medieval period. But I approach it systematically. So I start, the first chapter of the book, in fact, is called Choosing a Bride. I mean, since it's the life cycle, obviously you can start anywhere because it's a cycle. But I start with Choosing a Bride, which was an incredibly time-consuming, non-stop activity in all the royal courts of Europe. And certain basic decisions had to be made. For example, does the king or the heir to the throne choose a bride from his own aristocracy, or does he choose a foreign princess? And this was actually debated at the time. It's slightly later than the Middle Ages, but the Muscovite state in the 17th century, the Russian state, had a system of choosing brides. And there's a dialogue from the period in which one man is saying that the Tsar should always choose someone of his own subjects, and someone else is saying, no, the Tsar should get a princess from abroad. And the first guy says, well, I've got 40 reasons why he should marry one of his subjects. And the other guy says, well, I've got 400 why he should marry a foreign princess, and so on. So it was debated and thought about. And in fact, you can make a map. I've borrowed one from a German scholar for the book, a map showing which courts exchanged brides. And this was very important. And of course, it's not simply a matter of the high politics and the international diplomacy, which it was also, but it's also teenage girls being sent into strange environments and being trained to be the brides of foreign rulers. Sometimes they're sent quite young. Matilda, the daughter of Henry I of England, who is married to the King of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, is sent abroad at the age of about 8. She's betrothed, but not married at that age. And she stays in Germany to learn German. And she's not married until just before 12. The official age of marriage in the Western Church was 12. Girls couldn't be married before 12, although exceptions could be made. And sometimes they go into strange, different cultural ambiances, and even might have to change their names. There's a German aristocratic lady called Bertha of Sulzbach from a very high aristocratic family who goes to Byzantium, to the Byzantine Empire, to marry a son of the Byzantine emperor. And she's called Bertha, and that sounds funny to the Greeks. And so they get her to change her name to Irene. But she still sticks out a bit and doesn't quite fit in because she doesn't wear eye makeup. So you've got this kind of cultural international world created by the circulation of highborn women, or in fact, highborn girls mainly. And then you've got the rest of the life cycle, which is, for example, waiting for sons to be born. This was always going on. And of course, in this period, well, first of all, you don't know whether a woman is going to be fertile or not. And what if she's not? And B, if she is pregnant, you don't know whether the child is going to be male or female. And you can't know that until the birth. And so there's a lot of weight placed on this waiting for a son. An example I use is Louis VII of France, 12th century king of France. He marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, famously incarnated by Katharine Hepburn in the film The Lion in Winter. And she is fertile, but she gives him only girls over a long period of time. And in the end, he gets the marriage annulled. And this is quite important because Eleanor is the heir to the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is huge. And so he's giving up direct control of a huge part of France, his own kingdom, when he gets rid of Eleanor, because he's no longer her husband. And he remarries, and his second wife also just gives him girls, and she dies in childbirth. And then he marries again within a few weeks. He's now quite desperate to get a son. And his third wife is pregnant. And everyone in Paris is waiting for the outcome. And we have a poem written at the time by a student in Paris. Paris was a great university center. And the poem is, the whole city prays, God, let it be a boy. So you can see when I said it was a patriarchal society at the beginning of my comments, I wasn't kidding. And then you've got the issue which follows from this model of marriage, that now there's going to be illegitimate children of the king. And what's their place going to be? And it's quite interesting. There's some evidence that kings, certainly some kings, were very much fonder of their illegitimate than their legitimate children. And you can see in a way why, because the illegitimate children are the product of a marriage, or I beg your pardon, not a marriage, of a sexual liaison based on possibly affection, certainly desire, whereas the marriages are politically organized. And of course, the king and the bride might never have met before they get married. So there's a story of Henry II of England. He had 4 adult sons, but legitimate sons. But they were quite often in rebellion against him. He spent quite a lot of his mature years fighting his sons. He also had an illegitimate son, Geoffrey, who became Archbishop of York, which was one way of parking your illegitimate children. But Geoffrey was also a fighter, and he fought on behalf of his father in some of these wars. And there's an occasion when Henry, the father, meets up with Geoffrey, and he says to him, "You're my real son. It's the others who are the bastards." I'm going to conclude the first part of this talk about the life cycle part of the book, not with further general points, but just with a little case study to show you, how this works in practice in one particular case. It's from the Kingdom of Aragon. In 1134, the king, Alfonso the Battler, as he was known, dies from mortal wounds received in battle, as is very appropriate for his name. And he was rather unusual in that he left his kingdom in his will, not to any individual, but to the crusading orders, to the Templars, the Hospitallers, and so on. And so there would have been, if that had gone through, there would have been a state in Spain run by the Templars and Hospitallers. The aristocracy of Aragon were not at all keen on this, but the problem was Alfonso had only one male relative, his brother Ramiro, and Ramiro was a monk. And monks, as you know, are not supposed to marry. The aristocracy didn't take this as an objection. They forced Ramiro to leave his monastery. They married him to a highborn French lady. Within a few years, or shorter period, a couple of years, she had given birth to a daughter, Petronilla. And I said that there were cases of female rule. This is one of them. The aristocracy of Aragon accept Petronilla as the heir to the throne. Very quickly, Ramiro abdicates, goes back to his monastery, and Petronilla, as a baby girl, is Queen of Aragon. She needs to have a male protector. And as a baby girl, they arrange for her engagement to the ruler of the neighboring state of Barcelona, the County of Barcelona, the Count of Barcelona, Raymond Berenguer. He's 23 years her senior in age. So obviously sexual relations aren't going to take place for a while yet. But he is also someone who can run the Kingdom of Aragon while she is growing up. And eventually they do have sexual relations and she becomes pregnant for the first time. And here in my reading, this is the document that struck me most when I was reading for this book. There's a document for the Petronilla, Queen of Aragon, issues. It begins, "I, Petronilla, Queen of Aragon, laboring in childbirth at Barcelona, So she's actually issuing this document while she's in childbirth. And then she goes through the various options that would happen. If it is a boy that comes out of my womb, if it is a male that comes out of my womb, this will happen. If it is a female that comes out of my womb, this will happen. So she's working out the possibilities. And then she gives 2,000 gold coins to the churches of Aragon and Barcelona to pray for her. Because, of course, they didn't have gas and drugs and things. And she's a 14 or 15-year-old girl in her first pregnancy. But it does have a happy outcome. She does give birth to a healthy child, goes on to have several other children, and rules Aragon down to her time when she abdicates in favor of that son who she'd just given birth to. But you can see there all the different factors at work just in one case. The second part of the book is called A Sense of Dynasty, because if the first part is all about the biology, pregnancies and fertility and also death, I have a chapter on death that I haven't got time to talk about right here, but these dynasties were more than just biological units. They were not only biological units, they were political units and ideological units. And in the second half of the book, I try and talk about how did they create their identity? How did they see themselves? What was their sense of dynasty? And I look at various ways you can do that. The obvious way we do it now, when we talk about these dynasties, is we give them labels. We talk about the Plantagenets. You know, there are books called Plantagenet England. There's even a television series called The Plantagenets. The Kings of France. The Kings of France who ruled from 987 onwards are called the Capetians. Those titles were not used or scarcely used by the medieval kings of England and France. There's a 300-year period in the history of the English dynasty in which no one is called Plantagenet. They don't call themselves that. Why would they? Why do you need a surname if you're a king? The Capetians don't call themselves Capetians. So those are retrospective labels invented by historians. So I started looking at other ways that a sense of identity can be generated. And we've got lots of evidence about different ways that you could create the identity of a dynasty without actually having a label for it. One way also involves names. That is the choice of particular individual names for rulers. There are characteristic forenames, Christian names, that people use. And that can be used to identify the dynasty. Dante, for example, Dante in the Divine Comedy, he wants to refer to the kings who we call the Capetian kings of France. And he calls them the Philips and the Louis by whom France is now ruled. And that's absolutely right, because when he was writing the Divine Comedy, France had been ruled by a king called Philip or Louis for 256 years. So I have an investigation in the book of the choice of these names. What do they mean? And where did new names come in? Edward, for example, in Edward I of England is the first king since the Norman conquest to be called Edward, which is an Anglo-Saxon name. There have been Edwards before the conquest, but none afterwards. But his father, Henry III, was absolutely dedicated to Saint Edward the Confessor, the last king of the Wessex house. And because he's dedicated to that saint, he wants to call his oldest son Edward. So Edward comes in as a name. Edward had a son, Alfonso, who was heir to the throne for 10 or 12 years. But Alfonso dies, and we don't get a King Alfonso of England, but we could have got. And then, of course, Alfonso would have been an ordinary name. So you look at the naming patterns, and these trace cultural links and international links. Numbering, this, I think, without a doubt, is the most nerdish topic I've ever investigated. It's absolutely fascinating in a deeply nerdy way. When do kings start getting numbers? We're so familiar with them. Henry VIII, Louis XIV, etc., etc. When do they start getting numbers? And do they always choose them in a way that makes sense to us? And are there ever any conflicts or variations or contradictions in numbering patterns? The answer to all those questions is yes. I start actually with a story. I'm based in Scotland, in St Andrews. I start with the Scottish story. In 1952, the present Queen, Elizabeth, became queen. And in Britain, those of you who know Britain know that it's dotted with red pillar boxes, which are places you can post your letters and are picked up by the Royal Mail. And ever since they were invented in the Victorian period, supposedly invented by the novelist Trollope, or brought to England by the novelist, brought to Britain by the novelist Trollope, those pillar boxes have borne the royal logo. So under Queen Victoria, when they were first devised, there was VR, Victoria Regina, Queen Victoria. And that practice has been followed ever since. In 1952, when Elizabeth succeeded, they started putting these up, E2R, Elizabeth II Regina, Queen Elizabeth II. And many of them in Scotland were then blown up by the nationalists because Elizabeth is not the second Elizabeth to rule Scotland, she's the first. Because Elizabeth I, as we call her, ruled only England, not Scotland. So you can see it's actually, the numbering can be an explosive issue. And I go into the details of that, but there are also other ways that dynasties can establish their identity. There are dynastic saints. Sometimes, I've mentioned already, Henry III being devoted to Edward the Confessor. In the early Frankish kings were devoted to St. Martin. Sometimes dynasties produce their own saints. Saint Louis IX of France in the 13th century is a famous example. He's a Capetian. He's a fairly successful ruler with a very good reputation. He's canonized. He becomes a saint, and he's now later kings of France can look back to their own dynastic saint. So we have that as a possibility. You have your dynastic saints. You can put up great monuments and statues in the 14th century, early 14th century. Both the kings of France in Paris and the kings of Aragon in Barcelona, in their royal palaces, put up huge life-size statues of all their predecessors, all the previous kings of France, all the previous kings of Aragon, going back to the counts of Barcelona, in fact, beyond that. So there, if you went into the royal palace, you'd be surrounded by this huge, it's like a sort of super Madame Tussauds, except it's in stone, of all the ancestors of the royal dynasty. Heraldry is another thing I look at. In the 12th century, heraldry came into existence as a system, and it's a wonderful form for this primarily non-literate society. Most people in illiteracy was the general rule for a lot of the population, but heraldry is a language without words, and it tells you immediately what family someone is from. The symbols, these geometrical symbols, or the lions, or whatever it might be, tells you what family someone belongs to. And also, because it can be developed with slight variations in the coat of arms, it tells you perhaps which branch of the family. And even there's an indication of whether they're an illegitimate member of the family. I have an example with a picture in the book of the Count of Dou. The Count of Dou was a 15th century French nobleman, illegitimate son of a brother of the King of France. So he has the coat of arms of France with the mark on it that indicates he's not not descended from the main line, but there's a younger brother, and a mark indicating that he's illegitimate. And he puts that up on his hangings and his shield and everywhere. It's not a source of shame. Dou, by the way, is one of the people who fought with Joan of Arc at the Siege of Orleans and subsequently. And I also look at the graphic family tree. How do you picture your own family? Ancestry, research into ancestry is an absolute craze nowadays, and there are websites about it, there are databases, and so on and so forth. It's an absolute craze. And the tool that's often used is the graphic family tree, with horizontal lines showing the different siblings, and then vertical lines showing descent, and then some kind of symbol for marriage, and it goes down in time from the top down in time to the present. And that was really a creation of the 10th and 11th centuries for these dynasties, when they wanted to show the family tree. And it becomes more and more elaborate. And I look at the development of these family trees, both as in the techniques, how was it done? Some of them are in books, which mean you have to turn the pages all the time. Some of them are in very long rolls. Late medieval England has some family trees that are 20 feet long because they're on a scroll. And who goes on the family tree? And what about breaks in the dynasty? How is that shown? So these are all ways of creating a sense of identity, which is the subject of part 2 of the book. If I wanted to conclude with a couple of points about what might come out of this in very general terms, I'd say that the first thing is that the book demonstrates all sorts of things that could have happened. For example, Edward the Confessor. If Edward the Confessor had had a son to succeed him, the Norman conquest wouldn't have happened. England wouldn't have been ruled by a French-speaking elite throughout the Middle Ages, and the English language, the language that I'm speaking right at this moment, would be fundamentally different, much more Germanic, much less Romance in its structure. And that is because an 11th century king didn't have a son, or because his wife didn't have a son. And there are plenty of counterfactuals all along the way, because biology is very unpredictable. And the other thing is, to conclude these remarks before we move on to questions, I think this dynastic politics has left a very permanent imprint on the political map of modern Europe. Sometimes it's to do with dynastic unions, marriages. For example, both Spain, nowadays modern Spain, and modern Britain are the product of marriages, dynastic marriages of the 15th and early 16th century. And also in the creation of new countries. For example, France and Germany are very fundamental parts of the map of medieval and modern Europe. They didn't exist in the early Middle Ages. You just had an enormous kingdom of the Franks that stretched from Barcelona to Hamburg and from Brittany to northern Italy. Charlemagne's grandsons couldn't come to an agreement. They fought, they divided that Frankish kingdom up, and to simplify, half of it became Germany, half of it became France. That's a pretty important development, and it's all to do with dynastic politics. So, thank you for your attention. We have plenty of time for questions, and I have a little place here where questions can come up. I have one that says thanks. Does it say more than thanks? At what point? That's a very good question. This is, at what point, if at all, did illegitimate children become a source of shame? So that's a very good question. And I think the answer, I know the answer sounds a bit like I'm dodging the question. It depends on when and where, because I'll give you a concrete example. The Dukes of Burgundy, who were enormously powerful rulers and almost created a kingdom that became somewhere in between France and Germany in the late Middle Ages. They tried for the royal title, but didn't quite get it. They had large numbers of illegitimate children, and these actually bore titles. They were called the Bastard of Burgundy, and the chief one was called the Grand Bastard of Burgundy. And when they enlisted in university, which some of them did, they were enrolled in the lists of new students as Antoine, Bastard of Burgundy. So there's absolutely no shame there. But from that same milieu, the Burgundian court, we have a very interesting account. There are some knights who are from Eastern Europe. They're from Bohemia and Poland. And they are traveling in the West. And they come to Burgundy and they are amazed that at the court of the Dukes of Burgundy, the illegitimate sons sit around having dinner with the legitimate sons and are public. I have a little message, which I think I must ignore, excuse me. And the Bohemian and Polish nobles say, this is amazing. They're not a source of shame like they are with us. So you've got a wonderful example there of exactly the same period, the 15th century. In one part of Europe, your bastards are being enrolled in university as Bastard of Burgundy. And in another part of Europe, they regard the whole idea of acknowledging them as a source of shame. So obviously different times and different places. But in general, I think the very top level, the rulers, the kings, for the most part, were happy to acknowledge their illegitimate children. And there are even cases, and I go into this in the book, it's taking a little bit further from your question, but there are even cases where illegitimate sons, and in one case an illegitimate daughter, establish new dynasties, ruling dynasties. Portugal, for example. Portugal is an independent country from the rest of Spain because it became so in the 12th century because the Teresa, who was the illegitimate daughter of Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, didn't get on with her sister and broke away. And therefore, that's actually a country where an illegitimate daughter founds a new country. But you also get cases where illegitimate sons inherit an existing kingdom. And so you have dynasties. The late medieval kings of Castile, the House of Trastamare, it's called, all descend from an illegitimate son. So you've got generally, I think, high status recognition. I do have another question here. What's this one? Are there any significant examples in Christian Europe of models of dynastic succession that differ to the common father-to-son model? Was the transition to this type of model inevitable during medieval times? Well, I never know whether anything's inevitable. I try and establish sometimes whether it's happened. I don't know. I think inevitable brings us into philosophy, probably. But the question, models of dynastic succession that differ, the answer is yes. I think for example, in the native Irish dynasties, it was much more likely that a male adult of the previous king would succeed. It could be a brother or it could be a cousin, but there are, I can't think of a case of the son of a previous Irish ruler succeeding as a young child, which you get in the rest of Western Europe in the other model. In Poland, and I think it's also the case in Russia. I don't look into Russia very much because I don't have the requisite language, but I think it's the case too in Russia that you have a system of the family, the headship of the dynasty rotates by a principle called seniority, which is instead of going father-son, it goes from the previous ruler to the next oldest. And so that could be, again, it might be a brother or it might be a cousin. So definitely you have those systems. And I think I have a quite long discussion about the dynamics inside a family. If you are, for example, the younger brother of a king, you might put up with him having authority over you. You might put up with that. But what about his children? You maybe have seen them growing up as, sniveling little brats. And are you going to accept their authority over you? Which is, of course, why you have the phenomenon of the wicked uncle. You often have uncles who are not willing to put up with the father-son transmission. So you do have alternatives to father-son, sometimes formal, sometimes of the kind that I mentioned, the seniority system in Poland and Russia that was dominant, throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, and also just practically people who are not very happy to accept it. One of the very interesting transmissions of power occurs in France in 1316 when that father-son transmission comes to an end, and there the French have to make a choice between the daughter of the king who's died and the younger brother of the king who's died. And the daughter is quite young, and the younger brother, her uncle, is a wicked uncle, and he manages to seize the throne de facto, and he has to have a reason for excluding that little girl. And he says he says in France, women don't inherit. And up until then, there'd been no discussion of that rule at all. It hadn't happened, but there'd been no discussion of the rule. And therefore, for the rest of the Middle Ages, France had to have this rule saying women can't inherit. And it gets associated with a thing called the Salic or Salian law. And eventually it becomes a dynastic succession rule. Salic law means women are excluded from succession. And it hadn't existed before. And it carries on in certain countries. For example, Queen Victoria inherited from her predecessor the title of Queen of Great Britain, but she didn't inherit the Kingdom of Hanover, which he had ruled, because Hanover had Salic law. So that split in 1837 is due to that. I have a question here, which is how monarchs would distinguish themselves from predecessors of the same name before the use of regnal numbers. That's a very good question. I think in very many cases that I've looked at, or several cases I've looked at, not to exaggerate, it is the succession of a series of rulers with the same names that stimulates this use of numbers. In the 10th century, the kings of Germany, the emperors, were Otto I, Otto II, Otto III, we call them, 3 Ottos in a row. It's about that time that they start using numbers. In England, Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, that's what we call them. And you can actually see, I take the example of the Edwards, because we have a little bit of evidence about when they started numbering themselves. Edward I doesn't have to have a number. It's been hundreds of years before the previous Edwards of the Anglo-Saxon period. He's Edward, King of the English. That's pretty straightforward, right? There was only one of them. His son, Edward II, as we call him, is Edward, son of Edward. Edward, King of the English, son of King Edward. So Edward, son of King Edward, that's clear who he is. But then he's succeeded by his son, Edward, who we call Edward III. And Edward, son of Edward's getting a bit long. They made a conscious decision in about 1330 to number him Edward III. And of course, to do that, they had to discount all the Edwards of the Anglo-Saxon period, because there were at least 3 kings of England called Edward prior to 1066. So they don't start the numbering from them. They start the numbering from the Norman conquest. And he bears the title, this is his official title in official documentation, Edward, King of England, the 3rd since the conquest. So you can see there an actual definite choice of numbering. Alternative ways of doing it, of course, you could always have nicknames, and most of the nicknames that are applied to medieval kings are created very much later, sometimes hundreds of years later. But sometimes there are semi-official names, even some of them not necessarily very flattering. Louis VI of France was known as Louis the Fat, and that is actually recorded on documents of his grandson in official registers of the French monarchy. He's called Louis the Fat. And so you can do it by nicknames. You can do it by patronymics, father's name, you can do it by nicknames. But it does seem to be that situation, the one you're describing here, predecessors of the same name. If the predecessor is a long time before the same name, it doesn't matter very much, because it's usually clear then. But it's when you get successions of the one after the other with the same name. I mean, as I said, the number of monarchs, once you start into it, there's what's going to happen, But it, I think that I hope that answers the question. I'll see what this is. Could you speak about dower and dowry and how each was used in nation building respectively? Right. The distinction is between dower and dowry is what is, it's, to simplify it, the bride brings something with her to the wedding. It's usually given to her by her father. That's dowry. And the groom, the man marrying her, brings something which he gives to her, and that's dower. Those are the distinctions. So these are property transactions that take place on the marriage. A perfect example of the political implications of dowry is the marriage, and it's a wonderful example too of child marriage. Henry II of England has a son, Henry. Henry, unusually, the son was actually crowned in his father's lifetime. This is one way of ensuring succession, and I talk about this in the book at some length, being crowned in your father's lifetime. That's why he's known as Henry the Young King. He never succeeded to the throne, although many people call him Henry III, so that relates to this numbering issue. But to go to the specific issue of dowry, he is betrothed to the daughter of the King of France, and the dowry that is assigned with her is a region called the Vexin, which is a region bordering between Normandy on the one hand, which was ruled by Henry II, he was Duke of Normandy as well as King of England, and the lands of the King of France. And the agreement is that, you know, she will get this as her dowry when she gets married. So she's a little girl, she may be, I think, 3 or something like that. And she's sent to Henry II's court. She's betrothed to Henry, the one who's going to become Henry the Young King, who's about 5. And Henry II immediately organizes their actual marriage, not their betrothal, their marriage, which is very audacious and drew some criticism. But of course, it means he then gets the Vexin as her dowry. His son, his little son, is married to her, and he gets this important border area with some important fortresses in it. So that's one way in which this would work. Being in Scotland, of course, I'll have to give you a Scottish example, which is the acquisition of the Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland. Orkney and Shetland were ruled by the kings of Norway, not the kings of Scots in the Middle Ages. But in the 15th century, a marriage was arranged between the King of Scots and the Scandinavian princess. It's just as an aside, Norway and Denmark had the same ruler at this time. And so she's going to come with the dowry. The dowry is expressed in money, a very large amount of money, which the King of Norway, also King of Denmark, as I said, doesn't actually have on hand at the moment. So he says, well, I'll give you Orkney and Shetland as a sort of guarantee, you know, that I'll give you that. And that's a guarantee that I'm certainly going to give you the money. And when I give you the money, I'll get Orkney and Shetland back. But he never did give the money. So Orkney and Shetland became part of the Kingdom of Scotland. So that's a very clear example of what you might call an international marriage with a dowry promise, bringing as a consequence, not intentionally, but bringing as a consequence, a change in the territorial map of Europe. Orkney and Shetland now became part of the Kingdom of the Scots, not part of Norway. Later on, the Norwegians and the Danes offered to pay it off, but the Scots always refused it for some reason. So that's why the present political boundaries are those that we have now. And there are plenty of other examples. The most famous example of a really big build-up of territory through marriage, it might be dowry. It was often marrying heirs, female heirs, so inheritance as well, is the so-called House of Austria or the Habsburgs. And there was even a little tag, Austria happy in its marriages, because it built up an enormous, originally European and then eventually, of course, international with after 1492, international empire, one of the largest empires of the time. And much of the European side of that, not obviously the New World, but the European side of that was constructed through marriage. Dower tended to be less important in constructing states, but was important in terms of the power structures within the kingdom. Because take a kind of simple example, say a foreign princess comes to a country, her husband, the king or the heir to the throne, gives her the dower. He gives her property. It can be quite substantial. It could be castles. It could be whole, counties, administrative districts. But that is usually for her life, for her lifetime, and afterwards it will go to the heirs, and so will be reabsorbed. So it's important for the internal politics of kingdoms more than for the territorial construction of new states. And you can see that very clearly in many countries. There's been some very good work on the dower of the queens of Castile, for example. And it's true in England. In England, there were certain estates and properties that were in the queen's hands as dower. In fact, in the 12th century, sometimes entire counties are given to the queen, and those counties stop accounting at the royal court. They stop presenting their accounts. So they're in the Queen's pocket. We don't actually know what's happening there. They're, as it were, I don't know whether privatized is the right word. And sometimes there's a mark even in the names today. There's an area in London called Queen's Hythe, and Queen's Hythe, a hythe is a stretch of quay or jetty for trading vessels to tie up. That was the dower of the first wife of Henry I of England, who was a lady of mixed Anglo-Saxon and Scottish descent, and bore the Anglo-Saxon name Edith. But when she came to marry him, the Norman nobles laughed at the name Edith, so she had to become Matilda. There's another example of a woman having to change her name. And she was much revered. She was almost like a saint. And she had this hythe or jetty down in the Thames, where boats could tie up, and she got the income from it. It was part of her dower. And it was that's how it got its name. And it was actually remarked upon by people at the time because it was the first recorded place in London which had public toilets. Queen Hythe had public toilets. I don't know whether this is more information than you require, but it's historical fact. There's William Campbell. Is that my William Campbell? How common was it for either illegitimate sons or excess younger sons to be given ecclesiastical preferment? And do we have a sense of how willing they were to accept it rather than being strong-armed by their families? I think that is Bill Campbell. Right. I discussed this, and I think I'll give you a general conclusion first of all. I think it is much more common for aristocrats, that is not the top level, not the ruling dynasties, not the kings and the emperors, but the aristocrats, to put their younger sons and daughters into the church than it is for kings and emperors at the top level. I think that's the first point. So there's a distinction. Sure, I think the aristocratic younger children in the church is a very big phenomenon, but it's not so striking at the very top level. You do get examples of it, and in some times and places, it is indeed the illegitimate who are put into those places. I mentioned earlier on Geoffrey, Archbishop of York, the illegitimate son of Henry II of England, and there are many other examples. And in a way, that sort of surprised me, because you don't have to imagine, you can actually see the usefulness of kings having particularly brothers, because of course if the king puts a younger son into a position of ecclesiastical authority, when he dies and is succeeded by the oldest son, that means he'll have a brother. Perfect example is Bruno, Archbishop of Cologne in the 10th century, who was the younger brother of Otto I, and he was made Archbishop of Cologne. And of course that meant that he shouldn't have legitimate sons and heirs, so he was, in theory anyway, ruled out of the contest for the succession. He could provide a buttress for his brother, and he was made not only Archbishop of Cologne, but Duke of that whole area, and was bishops at this time were war leaders. They had castles and knights and so on. And so this area, Lotharingia, which is the western part of the Kingdom of Germany or the Holy Roman Empire, was a notoriously unstable and rebellious area. And so for a longish period, Otto I had a authority figure, the Archbishop of Cologne in this area, who was his brother. And you can see that that was useful. It was useful in terms of just running the kingdom. And I'm in a way I'm surprised it wasn't done more. But there are examples. There are always examples all over the place, but they're not systematic, and there's not large numbers of them. I think more common was not these illegitimate or excess younger sons, but daughters. I think it was more common in certain times and places. I'm writing, of course, about the whole of the Middle Ages and the whole of Europe, so I'm always going to be saying this. But I think in certain times and places, daughters being put into convents, and particularly into family convents, that is, ones that have been founded by the ruling dynasty, and they very often became abbesses. And if say the convents that were wealthy, landowning, that meant that the high-born daughters of rulers, most of the idea was that the daughters would be married off to maybe foreign kings or somebody like that. But of course, there were also daughters who were going to be put into these convents, and they could have a really good aristocratic life, because the richer nunneries were really centers of aristocratic ladies, without being in any way perpetuating claims through descent or anything to the throne. And normally, obviously, that would be much cheaper than any alternative and keeping them out of trouble. Edward I has a daughter called Mary, who's put into the convent, and we actually have her accounts, the surviving day-to-day balance sheet of what she was up to. And she spends a lot of time traveling. She's not stuck in the convent all the time. And she has lots of very nice sort of clothes and ornaments and things, and she has very large gambling debts. So she's being given a niche, which is a kind of respected, acknowledged area, keeps her away from practical politics, and gives her, definitely a lifestyle appropriate to a princess, which is what she was. I think this may well be my last question I have time for, this one here. To what degree was prowess in battle significant for creating and or sustaining a robust dynastic identity? That's a very good question, and I think I can say without doubt it's very significant. I'm just reading David Carpenter's new huge book on Henry III of England. It's 700 pages and it only covers half the reign, so I don't know what's going to happen in volume 2. And throughout, the theme of that is Henry III's feeble record as a war leader, and the contrast with his contemporary, Louis IX, St. Louis, who was not always successful in war. He was famously captured during his crusading invasion of Egypt and held prisoner, and his army decimated. So not always successful, but nevertheless aggressive, active, determined. And that seems to be a very important feature of successful kings, and one that would certainly be perpetuated as a memory in the dynasty. And kings who are not successful, King John of England, his nickname, he started off because he was the youngest son and he didn't actually have an endowment, John Lackland, but he was also known as John Soft Sword. And I don't think in this patriarchal, aggressive world, being called Soft Sword was anything other than a very remarkable insult. So I think battle prowess is one of the things these rulers do. In fact, in the later Middle Ages in France, I mentioned in France they developed this rule that women couldn't inherit the throne. One of the arguments put forward was that because you need a ruler who can fight, you need a king. And in this world, military activity and military prowess was associated with men, not with women. In fact, very early on in the book, I cited a little quotation, which is describing someone he's a hero of the First Crusade, and he's talking about his upbringing. And it says, for training in war, there is his father. For the veneration of God, there is his mother. So you have a very clear binary distinction. There's his dad to teach him how to fight, and his mother to tell him to go to church and so on. I think that is probably near the conclusion. Thank you for such interesting questions that went straight to the heart of the matter. I hope that you will enjoy reading the book if you decide to, and that you'll come away with a good idea of the unpredictability of dynastic politics, its formative influence on Europe, and it's I think a fundamental feature of European history and perhaps of any dynastic system, even beyond Europe. Thank you very much.